Long before history learned how to remember itself, civilization had already begun to forget. There was no single day when it ended, no final sunrise watched by a city that knew it would not see another, no moment when a bell rang to announce that something vast and fragile had broken. Instead, the first collapse of civilization happened quietly, so quietly that those living through it did not know they were standing inside the ruins of something new. They woke each morning as they always had. They walked the same paths, they touched the same walls warmed by the sun. They carried water, tended fields, and spoke familiar words in familiar places. And yet with each passing season, something essential was slipping away. This is the story of that slow disappearance, a story not of destruction but of unraveling, not of fire and conquest but of exhaustion, imbalance, and time. To understand the first collapse of civilization, we must first return to a world where civilization itself was an experiment, fragile, recent, and unsure of its own permanence. At the beginning, there was no idea of collapse, there was only survival. For tens of thousands of years, humans lived in small groups that moved with the land. They followed animals, seasons, and water. They owned little. They built nothing meant to last forever. When the land could no longer support them, they left, and the land healed behind them. But eventually, something changed. Along the banks of slow-moving rivers, humans began to stay. The soil there was dark and soft. Floods came each year, leaving behind fresh layers of fertile earth. Seeds sprouted easily. Harvests became predictable, and predictability changed the human mind. For the first time, the future felt close enough to plan. Fields replaced forests, villages replaced camps, and permanence replaced movement. Houses were built not for seasons but for generations. Granaries rose beside fields, paths hardened into roads, and people began to live beside strangers they did not know personally. This was civilization in its earliest form, not a grand empire, but a fragile arrangement of cooperation, trust, and control. It worked because it had to. Food surpluses allowed some people to stop farming. Those people became builders, administrators, priests, and record keepers. Authority emerged slowly, justified by the need to organize water, labor, and storage. Canals were dug, fields expanded, cities grew, and for the first time humans lived surrounded by walls that separated them from the land that fed them. At first, this separation felt like safety. The earliest cities were not loud places. They were not crowded in the way modern cities are. Much of the land inside them remained open, filled with gardens, courtyards, and animals. But even in their quiet beginnings, cities carried a hidden cost. They depended on systems. Water had to arrive at the right time in the right amount. Fields had to be planted and harvested according to shared schedules. Surpluses had to be stored and distributed fairly enough to prevent unrest. Records had to be kept. Authority had to be obeyed. Civilization was not built on strength alone. It was built on coordination, and coordination required trust not just in people but in the environment itself. The rivers had always flooded, the rains had always come, the soil had always renewed itself. No one imagined a world where these things might stop. As generations passed, civilization grew more confident. Cities expanded beyond their original boundaries. New fields were carved from wetlands and plains. Canals stretched farther, reaching land that had never been farmed before. Each expansion felt like success. More land meant more grain meant more people meant more labor, and more labor meant even greater expansion. But beneath this growth, the land was quietly changing. Water carried not only life but salt. Each year, as irrigation water evaporated under the sun, tiny crystals remained in the soil, invisible at first, harmless seeming, but relentless. Fields that once produced abundant harvests began yielding slightly less. Farmers compensated by planting more, digging more canals, irrigating more frequently. The solution to the problem became the cause of its deepening, and still no one spoke of collapse. Why would they? From the perspective of a single lifetime, everything seemed stable. A bad harvest here, a dry year there. These were inconveniences, not warnings. Civilization had weathered difficulties before. It would weather these as well, or so it seemed. Power, too, was changing. As cities grew, so did the distance between those who labored in the fields and those who organized their output. Decision-making concentrated at the center. Authority hardened into hierarchy. This was not cruelty, it was efficiency. Someone had to decide how water was distributed. Someone had to manage storage. Someone had to command labor during floods, droughts, and construction. Over time, these roles became permanent, inherited, enforced. Civilization became more complex and more brittle. The people who controlled resources often lived far from the land that produced them. Their understanding of fields and seasons became abstract, filtered through reports and records, and when stress arrived, abstraction proved dangerous. Climate does not announce itself. It does not declare intention. It does not warn civilizations before it shifts. Years passed when the rains came later than expected. Floods arrived weaker or not at all. Rivers changed their paths slightly, subtly enough to disrupt carefully planned systems. At first, the changes were explained away. A temporary dry cycle, an unlucky decade, a test of faith, but the dry years persisted. Fields that had been farmed continuously for generations struggled to recover. Grain yields fell further, surpluses shrank. Civilization responded as it always had by demanding more labor, more land, more control. Farmers were pressed harder. Marginal lands were brought under cultivation. Forests were cleared, wetlands drained, short-term survival improved, long-term resilience weakened. The balance that civilization depended upon between land, water, labor, and authority began to tilt. Still, life continued. Children were born, markets opened each morning, prayers were spoken. Collapse does not feel like collapse while it is happening. What does collapse feel like then? It feels like small disappointments accumulating. A field abandoned because it no longer produces enough to justify the labor. A canal left unrepaired because there are not enough workers. A trade route that falls silent because surplus goods are no longer surplus. Cities do not empty overnight, they contract. Houses fall into disrepair, districts thin out. Public works decay slowly, one broken section at a time. Records become shorter, less detailed, fewer. Writing, once essential, becomes a luxury. And authority, once respected, becomes distant. At some point, people begin to leave, not as refugees fleeing disaster, but as families seeking better conditions elsewhere. They move upstream, toward smaller settlements, toward places where the land is less exhausted and systems are simpler. This movement is not chaotic, it is practical. Civilization loses people not through violence, but through choice. Those who remain adapt their expectations. They live with less, they rebuild smaller. They rely more on local networks and less on centralized control. The great cities, once symbols of permanence, begin to feel hollow. Walls still stand, temples still rise above the skyline, but the rhythms that sustain them weaken. And eventually the idea of the city itself changes. The first collapse of civilization was not an ending, it was a transformation. The knowledge of agriculture did not disappear. Writing did not vanish entirely. Social organization persisted in smaller, more flexible forms, but something crucial was lost. The confidence that civilization was inevitable. The belief that growth could continue without limit. The assumption that complexity guaranteed stability. Those who lived through this period did not write histories of collapse. They wrote less and less until writing itself became rare. What survived were traces, broken walls, abandoned canals, layers of soil that tell a story without words. Centuries later, new civilizations would rise upon these ruins. They would rediscover farming, cities, writing, and power. They would believe they were building something entirely new. They were not. They were continuing an experiment that had already failed once, and as they built, the memory of the first collapse faded into silence. The world did not feel broken. It felt narrower. The horizon did not vanish, but it seemed closer than it once had. Distances that were once traveled without thought now required planning. Journeys that had been routine became rare, not because roads were blocked or cities burned, but because there was no longer a reason to go. Trade depends on excess, and excess was disappearing. In earlier generations, merchants had moved along rivers and paths carrying grain, wool, pottery, copper, and stone. They connected cities to one another, binding them into something larger than any single place. But as harvests weakened and storage shrank, fewer goods left the city gates. Markets still opened each morning, but they felt quieter. Fewer voices called out prices. Fewer carts arrived from distant lands, and fewer strangers passed through. Life did not stop, it contracted. In the fields beyond the city walls, the land told its own story. Farmers noticed it first because they always did. The soil was harder now, lighter in color. It cracked more easily under the sun. Water no longer soaked in the way it once had. Instead, it pooled briefly, then vanished, leaving behind a faint white residue. Salt, not enough to kill a field outright, just enough to weaken it. Farmers changed their crops. Barley replaced wheat. Hardier plants replaced delicate ones. Yields stabilized briefly, then declined again. Each adaptation bought time. None restored balance. And so fields were abandoned, not dramatically, but reluctantly. A decision made after seasons of poor returns. A calculation whispered between family members, a slow retreat toward land that still responded to effort. Civilization did not fail everywhere at once, it failed unevenly. Inside the city, authority struggled to keep pace with reality. Records still listed expected yields, quotas still existed, labor obligations remained unchanged. The system assumed continuity because the system had been built for continuity. To acknowledge decline would have required rewriting everything: laws, expectations, hierarchies, and so the system pressed harder. More labor was demanded from fewer people. Taxes increased as storage dwindled. Public works were postponed, then abandoned entirely. Canals silted up, walls cracked, temples were repaired more slowly. Not because people no longer cared, but because there were only so many hours in a day and survival was reclaiming them. In homes throughout the city, routines shifted. Meals grew simpler, portions grew smaller, festivals shortened. Children still learned the old stories, but fewer could read the old signs. Writing required time, materials, and purpose. All three were becoming scarce. When writing fades, memory changes, history becomes oral, flexible, local. The great narratives of the city, its founding, its gods, its destiny, begin to blur. They are still spoken, but with less certainty. Details shift, emphasis changes. The future, once imagined as a continuation of the present, becomes uncertain, not feared, just unclear. People adapt remarkably well to decline. They lower expectations quietly. They redefine normal. What would have once been considered hardship becomes routine. A house with fewer repairs. A canal that runs only part of the year. A city that feels half its former size. These changes do not provoke panic. They provoke adjustment. Collapse is not experienced as loss. It is experienced as normalization. Beyond the city, smaller settlements began to thrive. Villages that had once been marginal found new relevance. Their systems were simpler. Their dependence on centralized authority was minimal. Their land less exhausted. People moved there not because they rejected civilization, but because they sought stability. A smaller life, closer to the land, felt safer than a grand system that no longer delivered certainty. This movement drained cities further. Not through force, through preference. Those who remained in the great urban centers were not fools or victims. They were often those most invested in the system: administrators, priests, craftsmen, families tied to urban life by skill or belief. They worked to preserve what remained. Temples continued rituals. Officials continued record-keeping even as the records grew thinner. Craftsmen repaired what could be repaired, salvaged what could be salvaged. There is dignity in persistence. But persistence alone cannot reverse structural decline. At some point, authority stops expanding and begins defending. Rules multiply, penalties harden, control tightens, not because leaders are cruel, but because the system they inhabit is shrinking, and shrinking systems feel threatened by flexibility. Innovation becomes risky, deviation becomes dangerous, and yet rigidity accelerates decline. Civilization becomes less able to respond to change precisely when adaptation is most needed. Generations pass. Children grow up never knowing the city at its height. For them, the smaller version is the only version that has ever existed. They do not feel loss, they feel familiarity. And because of that, collapse leaves no clear memory, only layers. Eventually, the city reaches a point where it no longer functions as a city. Not because walls fall or enemies arrive, but because its defining features, specialization, surplus, coordination, no longer exist in sufficient measure. Remains is a settlement, then a village, then a place people once lived. Grass grows where streets once ran. Animals move through spaces once crowded with voices. Wind erodes corners that human hands no longer maintain. The land does not mourn, it absorbs. Time passes differently after collapse. Years blur, decades slip by unnoticed. Without records, chronology loses precision. Events are remembered relative to people, not dates. Before my grandfather's time, after the great dry years. When the old canal still flowed, history becomes intimate, and then it becomes myth. Centuries later, new people arrive. They see ruins without context, walls without names, stones arranged too deliberately to be natural but too worn to be understood. They wonder who built these places, why they were abandoned, what kind of people lived there. They invent stories, giants, gods, ancient kings. They do not imagine farmers struggling with salt and water management. That kind of explanation feels too ordinary, but collapse is ordinary. The first collapse of civilization did not teach its lessons loudly. It did not leave warnings carved into stone. It did not preserve manuals for future societies. Its knowledge was lost because it was lived, not recorded, and because of that it would be repeated. As new civilizations rose elsewhere, they followed similar paths: fertile land, surplus, growth, complexity. Each believed itself unique. Each believed its systems were stronger, its gods more protective, its knowledge more advanced. None believed they were continuing a fragile experiment that had already failed once. The silence left by the first collapse was not empty, it was fertile. It allowed new beginnings without old cautions. It allowed confidence to return unchallenged. It allowed civilization to forget that it had limits. That forgetting may have been necessary. A civilization that remembered collapse too clearly might never dare to grow again. Life continued because it had to. There was no other option. For those living within the long decline, each day still began with light and ended with darkness. The sun still rose over fields and ruins alike. Children still woke hungry. Elders still remembered seasons past. Work still waited to be done. collapse from the inside did not feel like history. It felt like responsibility. A farmer did not wake thinking about civilization. He thought about soil, water, and the condition of his tools. He noticed that the ground was harder than it had been in his youth. He noticed that canals required more effort to keep clear. He noticed that fewer neighbors came to help at planting time. But he also noticed that grain still grew, just not as much. So he adjusted. He planted closer together. He harvested more carefully. He stored what he could and hoped it would last. Hope became practical. Families adapted their lives in quiet ways. Homes grew smaller as unused rooms collapsed and were not rebuilt. Roofs were patched rather than replaced. Broken pottery was mended again and again until it could no longer hold water and became a container for grain instead. Nothing was wasted. Children learned skills earlier. They worked alongside adults, not because of hardship alone, but because there were fewer hands available. Education became experiential rather than formal. Knowledge passed through demonstration, not instruction. The rhythms of life slowed. Festivals that once lasted days became single evenings. Rituals remained, but their scale diminished. Offerings grew symbolic rather than abundant. Gods were still honored, but expectations softened. In earlier times, people believed the gods guaranteed abundance if properly appeased. As conditions worsened, belief shifted. The gods were no longer expected to provide, they were expected to endure. Faith adapted just as people did. Prayers asked not for prosperity, but for stability. For the river to flow, for crops to survive, for children to live. Religion became less triumphant and more intimate. Trade, once expansive, became local. A farmer traded grain for tools made by someone he knew personally. A potter exchanged vessels for food grown nearby. Distance became costly. Trust became essential. This localization made life more resilient in some ways. Smaller networks were easier to manage. Dependency on distant systems faded, but it also meant isolation. Ideas traveled slowly. Innovation spread unevenly. Each community solved problems independently, sometimes repeating mistakes others had already learned from. The shared knowledge of civilization fragmented. Those who remembered earlier abundance became living archives. Elders told stories of larger harvests, fuller markets, grander buildings. Their memories were met with a mix of respect and disbelief. Children listened politely, but such stories felt unreal. Like myths, memory without reinforcement fades, and when elders died, much of what they knew vanished with them. Over generations, language itself changed. Words associated with old institutions fell out of use. Titles lost meaning. Administrative terms became archaic. The language of coordination gave way to the language of survival. When words disappear, so do the concepts they carried. Civilization does not only collapse materially, it collapses linguistically. Some places held on longer than others. Cities located near more reliable water sources persisted. Communities that diversified crops adapted better. Those less entangled in rigid hierarchies responded more flexibly. There was no single pattern. Collapse was not uniform. It was uneven, scattered, and personal. In rare moments, conflict erupted. Competition over water, disputes over land, tensions between those who stayed and those who left, but violence was not the defining feature of this collapse. Scarcity encourages cooperation as often as it encourages conflict. Survival depends on both. Most people chose negotiation over confrontation. They could not afford otherwise. As years turned into decades, something subtle happened. People stopped identifying themselves primarily by city. Identity shifted toward family, village, and land. The idea of belonging to a vast, interconnected civilization felt abstract, unnecessary. Civilization faded not because people rejected it, but because they no longer needed to imagine themselves within it. Ruins became part of the landscape. Children played among broken walls without knowing who built them. Stones were repurposed into homes, fences, and hearths. The past was not revered, it was useful. History became material. A fallen column was no longer a symbol. It was a building block. Time softened the edges of loss. What had once been a collapse became simply the way things were, and in that normalization, grief dissolved. Humans are remarkably capable of accepting diminished circumstances if they are stable. Stability matters more than scale. Occasionally, someone would try to restore the old ways. An ambitious leader would gather people to repair canals on a larger scale. A priest would revive old rituals, promising renewal. An administrator would attempt to reintroduce centralized control. Sometimes it worked briefly, but without sustained surplus and environmental support, these efforts faded. Complex systems require constant energy. Decline reduces available energy. Eventually, effort exceeds return. Nature reclaimed what was abandoned. Fields reverted to scrubland. Canals filled with sediment. Wild animals returned to places once densely populated. This was not destruction, it was succession. The land was not hostile, it was patient. Generations passed without knowing they lived after a collapse. They did not frame their lives as post-anything, they framed them as normal, and because of that the collapse left no clear emotional scar, no trauma passed down intact, only altered conditions. When future civilizations emerged, they encountered the remnants of this world as mystery. They saw evidence of organization beyond their own, structures too old to remember. Systems too complex to imagine had failed. They assumed catastrophe, but catastrophe is loud. This collapse was quiet, and quiet things are easily misunderstood. The first collapse of civilization was not a lesson written in fire. It was a lesson written in erosion, in gradual loss, in adaptation, in forgetting. Time does not pause after a collapse, it flows around it. Long after the great cities had thinned and fallen quiet, long after canals filled with dust and memory softened into myth, the land continued its slow, patient rhythms. Rivers shifted their courses, floodplains renewed themselves unevenly, patches of soil recovered while others remained scarred by salt and neglect. The world did not end, it rearranged itself. And in that rearrangement, space was made for something familiar to return. New settlements appeared gradually, often not far from the old ones. People are drawn to the same features again and again: water, fertile soil, natural routes of movement. Even when memory fades, geography remains persuasive. At first, these new communities were small. Villages clustered near reliable streams. Fields were modest. Tools were simple. The scale of ambition matched the scale of certainty. People remembered dimly that large systems could fail, even if they did not remember why. Caution lingered like an inherited instinct, but caution does not last forever. As generations passed without major disruption, confidence returned. Children grew up knowing only stability. Elders spoke of hardship that no longer seemed relevant. The land appeared generous again. Surplus returned slowly, then more reliably, and with surplus came choice. Some people farmed more than they needed. Others stopped farming altogether. Specialization reemerged, quietly, logically, inevitably. Someone made better tools, someone stored grain, someone organized labor. Coordination returned not as memory, but as necessity. The first walls of the new cities were humble. They were not built to impress, but to define, to mark space, to protect resources, to create a sense of inside and outside. At first, these walls enclosed little more than storehouses and gathering places, but over time, homes clustered around them. Paths formed, markets appeared. The city returned not as a conscious revival, but as a pattern reasserting itself. Civilization does not require intention, it emerges when conditions allow. Writing returned too, not immediately, not fully. Early marks were practical, tallies, symbols for goods, records of exchange. Writing was not yet literature or law, it was accounting. Memory outsourced itself again, and with writing came power. Those who controlled records controlled distribution. Those who managed storage managed survival. Authority consolidated slowly, often unnoticed by those who benefited from it. Once again, civilization grew around systems. These new civilizations did not see themselves as inheritors of a failed past. They saw themselves as pioneers. They believed they were discovering solutions, not repeating experiments. The ruins nearby were curiosities, not warnings. Their builders were imagined as different people, less advanced, less wise, less favored. Progress requires forgetting. If every generation fully remembered collapse, growth would feel irresponsible, and so forgetting became part of survival. As cities grew, trade expanded, routes reconnected regions, goods flowed farther, ideas traveled faster, specialization deepened, the world felt larger again, and with that feeling came confidence, the sense that civilization was not only stable but destined to grow, destined to expand, destined to endure. This belief did not arise from arrogance, it arose from success. Yet beneath that success, familiar pressures returned. Fields expanded farther from water sources. Irrigation systems grew more complex. Maintenance required coordination across larger populations. Surplus fed growth. Growth demanded surplus. The balance tightened. Civilization once again leaned heavily on stability it did not control. Environmental change is subtle when it begins. Rainfall patterns shift slightly. Flood timing varies, rivers carry different sediments, soil chemistry changes incrementally. No single generation sees the full arc, each responds to immediate conditions, adapting, adjusting, compensating. The system holds until it doesn't. What makes collapse so difficult to perceive is that its early stages resemble normal challenge. A dry year is not collapse, a failed harvest is not collapse. Even several difficult decades can be survived. Civilization is resilient, but only within limits. The danger lies in mistaking resilience for invincibility. As complexity increases, so does fragility. More systems mean more points of failure. More coordination means greater dependence on compliance and communication. More specialization means fewer people able to adapt independently when systems falter. This is not a flaw, it is a trade-off. Civilization trades flexibility for efficiency. And efficiency works until conditions change faster than systems can adapt. The people living through the rise of new civilizations did not think in these terms. They thought about opportunity, about building larger structures, about organizing more ambitious projects, about leaving something behind that would last. They believed permanence could be constructed, and for a time they were right, but permanence is not built. It is borrowed from stable climates, from fertile soils, from predictable rivers, borrowed until those conditions shift. As new civilizations flourished, echoes of the first collapse remained buried beneath layers of success. Salt still accumulated in soil. Irrigation still altered landscapes. Deforestation still changed local climates. Each generation inherited slightly altered conditions and adapted to them as best it could. Adaptation masked decline. There is a quiet tragedy in this pattern. Not because collapse happens, but because it happens without awareness. The first collapse could have taught future civilizations something profound, that balance matters more than growth and restraint more than expansion. but that lesson was never recorded clearly enough to survive. And so civilization learned the wrong lesson instead. That collapse belonged to the past, to less advanced people, to circumstances that no longer applied. When new declines came, and they were framed differently. As invasions, as moral failures, as divine punishment, explanations focused outward or upward, rarely inward. It is easier to blame enemies or gods than systems. Across centuries, the land itself became a palimpsest. Layers of settlement built upon settlement. Each new city reused stones from the last. Each canal followed older channels, sometimes unknowingly. Civilization literally built itself atop its own failures. The ground beneath cities held memories humans no longer carried. Occasionally, something ancient resurfaced, a buried wall exposed by erosion, an old canal rediscovered during construction, a strange alignment of ruins no one could explain. These moments inspired wonder, not caution. People admired the scale of past works without asking why they had been abandoned. Admiration replaced inquiry. Civilization thrives on stories of ascent, founding myths, golden ages, heroes and laws. Stories of decline are less appealing. They challenge the idea that progress is natural and continuous, and so they are simplified, dramatized, or forgotten. The quiet truth of the first collapse, that civilization can fade without violence, without villains, without clear endings, does not translate easily into myth. It resists drama. Yet that quiet truth is the most important one, because it reveals something essential about humanity. We are not undone by catastrophe alone. We are undone by imbalance sustained too long. An imbalance often feels like success until it doesn't. The people who lived through the first collapse did not fail. They adapted, they survived, they continued. The failure, if it can be called that, was not moral or intellectual, it was structural. Civilization asked more of the land than the land could give indefinitely. And when the land responded with silence rather than abundance, civilization shrank to fit what remained. This is not a story of punishment. It is a story of limits. As new civilizations rose and fell in turn, fragments of this truth occasionally surfaced. A proverb about moderation, a law limiting land use, a ritual honoring balance. These fragments appeared, then faded. They were insufficient on their own. The first collapse of civilization did not end history. It set a pattern of growth and strain, of confidence and forgetting, of rebuilding without remembering. This pattern would repeat many times in many places across millennia. Sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, but always shaped by the same underlying tension between human ambition and environmental reality. Every civilization lives inside a relationship it does not fully understand. It believes it understands itself, its laws, its beliefs, its stories, its achievements. It knows the names of its rulers and the shape of its cities. It records its victories and explains its failures. But beneath all of that, deeper than culture and politics, civilization depends on forces that do not speak, do not negotiate, and do not remember promises. Climate, energy, soil, water, time. These forces do not care what humans believe about permanence. They respond only to balance. The first collapse of civilization cannot be understood through events alone. There was no single invasion, no decisive battle, no moment when the world visibly cracked. Instead, collapse emerged from pressure applied slowly enough that it felt manageable, normal, even familiar. This is the most dangerous kind of pressure. Civilization is at its core an energy system. Food is energy, labor is energy, surplus is stored energy. When humans learned how to farm, they learned how to capture energy from the sun more efficiently than ever before. Plants transformed sunlight into grain. Grain became calories, calories became labor. Labor built structures that allowed even more energy to be captured and stored. This feedback loop powered civilization's rise, but every energy system has limits. Soil nutrients are not infinite. Water cycles can be disrupted. Forests do not regrow instantly. Rivers do not flood predictably forever. Civilization expanded as if these systems were endlessly forgiving. They were not. The first civilizations existed during a period of relative climatic stability. Floods arrived with reassuring regularity. Seasons followed familiar patterns. This stability made planning possible and rewarded investment in long-term systems. Civilization mistook stability for permanence. When conditions shifted, even slightly, the systems built upon them struggled, not because humans were ignorant, but because the scale of their systems reduced their flexibility. Small communities can move, large ones must adapt in place, and adaptation is slower than movement. As civilizations grew, they accumulated complexity. Complexity is seductive. It allows specialization. It increases efficiency. It creates comfort and predictability, but complexity also creates dependency. When one part of a complex system fails, other parts suffer even if they are functioning properly. An irrigation canal breaks and farmers lose crops. Farmers lose crops and storage shrinks. Storage shrinks and administrators impose stricter controls. Stricter controls increase resentment and reduce cooperation. Reduced cooperation weakens maintenance. Failure cascades, not catastrophically, but persistently. In early civilizations, energy margins were thin. A few bad years could erase decades of progress. A small reduction in yield could destabilize entire regions. This fragility was not visible during times of abundance. It revealed itself only under stress. Civilizations often respond to stress by doubling down on what once were. More control, more expansion, more extraction. These responses are logical in the short term. They buy time, but buying time is not the same as restoring balance. The first collapse unfolded because the solutions applied were additive, not corrective. When yields dropped, more land was farmed rather than resting existing fields. When water grew scarce, canals were extended rather than reduced. When authority weakened, enforcement intensified rather than decentralizing control. Each solution addressed symptoms, none addressed causes. Humans are excellent problem solvers, but we struggle with problems that emerge slowly without clear boundaries or endpoints. Collapse is not a problem with a finish line, it is a condition. Time plays a central role in this story. Civilization operates on human timescales, seasons, years, generations. Environmental systems often operate on longer cycles. Soil salinization can take centuries to become obvious. Climate shifts unfold over lifetimes, not weeks. Feedback loops accumulate quietly before expressing themselves suddenly. By the time a civilization recognizes the problem, it is already deeply embedded. The people of the first collapse did not lack intelligence, they lacked perspective. No individual lived long enough to see the full arc of decline. Each generation experienced only a segment, a period of adjustment, adaptation, or strain. From within that segment, collapse was not obvious. It looked like life. There is a profound lesson here. Collapse does not require ignorance. It does not require malice. It does not require failure of imagination. It requires only the continuation of success under changing conditions. Civilization rewards behaviors that increase production, organization, and control. These behaviors work until they don't. When conditions shift, those same behaviors can accelerate decline. But abandoning them feels irrational, even dangerous. And so civilization continues forward, confident in tools that once served it well. The first collapse revealed an uncomfortable truth. Civilization is not a permanent state, it is a phase that arises under certain conditions and recedes when those conditions change. This does not mean civilization is doomed, it means it is contingent. After the first collapse, humanity did not abandon civilization, it refined it. Each new iteration incorporated lessons, better tools, improved crops, more sophisticated governance. But some lessons remained elusive, especially the lesson of restraint. Growth feels virtuous, it feeds people, it creates opportunity, it produces visible success. Restraint feels like sacrifice, it limits ambition, it delays reward, it asks people to accept less today for a future they may never see. Civilizations rarely choose restraint voluntarily, they adopt it only when forced. The first collapse forced restraint by removing surplus. People adapted not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The adaptation was successful in human terms. Populations stabilized, life continued, new forms of organization emerged, but the memory of why restraint mattered faded. As centuries passed, humanity came to see collapse as something external, something caused by invaders, disasters, or divine displeasure. The idea that collapse could emerge internally from ordinary decisions repeated over time was too unsettling. It challenged the belief that progress was under human control, yet that is precisely what the first collapse demonstrates. Civilization is not undone by dramatic mistakes. It is undone by reasonable choices made consistently under assumptions that no longer hold. Understanding this requires a different way of thinking about history. Not as a sequence of events, but as a pattern of pressures. Not as a moral narrative, but as a systems narrative. The first collapse was not unique because it was the first. It was unique because it revealed the underlying mechanics of all collapses to come: environmental strain, complexity, delayed feedback, adaptation masking decline. These elements would appear again and again in different combinations across different cultures and eras. If the first collapse left a message, it was not carved into stone. It was written into the landscape, in abandoned canals, in salted fields, in ruins reused and forgotten. The land remembered what people did not. This is why archaeology matters, not because it romanticizes the past, but because it exposes patterns humans are otherwise inclined to ignore. Ruins are not warnings, they are records, records of what worked and what slowly stopped working. As we look back at the first collapse, it is tempting to judge, to ask why they did not change sooner, why they did not see the signs, why they did not act differently. But judgment misses the point. They acted as humans always do, responding to immediate needs with the tools and knowledge available to them. The challenge is not intelligence, it is scale. The first collapse teaches us that civilization is not fragile because humans are weak. It is fragile because it is powerful. Power amplifies both success and error. What survived the first collapse was not stone, it was not walls, it was not temples, it was not cities. What survived was human behavior, the habits, the instincts, the quiet ways people adjusted when the world around them no longer behaved as expected. When civilization loosened its grip, humanity did not fall with it. Human life narrowed, but it did not end. Human meaning shifted, but it did not disappear. And in that narrowing, something essential was revealed. After the systems failed, people learned again how little was truly required. Food, water, shelter, connection. These needs had never changed. Only the layers built around them had. When those layers thinned, life became more immediate, more grounded, more attentive. People paid closer attention to seasons. They watched the sky. They watched the river. They watched the soil. Without large institutions to absorb risk, individuals became observers again. Knowledge returned to the body. when to plant, when to wait, when to move. This knowledge was not written down, it was lived. Communities grew smaller but stronger. Trust mattered more than scale. Reputation mattered more than authority. Decisions were made close to consequences. If a choice failed, its cost was felt immediately. There was no distant system to blame. This closeness created caution, and caution created resilience. Life became quieter, not empty, quieter. There were fewer large gatherings. Fewer spectacles, fewer grand promises, but there was conversation, work done side by side, stories told slowly, time shared without urgency. The collapse removed noise. Children grew up differently. They learned by watching rather than being told. They learned the land before learning stories about the land. They learned limits early, not as fear, as familiarity. They did not expect abundance. They appreciated it when it came. The memory of cities faded unevenly. In some places, ruins remained visible. In others, they disappeared beneath soil and vegetation. Where ruins remained, they lost meaning. A wall was no longer a symbol of power. It was a windbreak, a foundation, a place to sit. Meaning followed usefulness. Over time, the idea of a before grew vague. Stories compressed centuries into moments. There was a time when the world was larger. No details followed, only a sense. This vagueness mattered. It allowed people to live without mourning something they could not clearly imagine. Grief requires specificity. Collapse erased detail. Civilization in its first form dissolved into a human-scale world, and in that world something unexpected happened. Life stabilized, not at a higher level, not at a lower one, at a sustainable one. This is difficult to accept because history often frames collapse as failure, but from another perspective, collapse can be seen as correction. A return to equilibrium, not painless, but effective. The land slowly recovered where pressure eased. Fields left fallow regained nutrients. Water systems simplified themselves. Forests reclaimed margins. The environment responded not to intention but to absence. Humans responded in kind. They learned to fit themselves to the land again rather than reshaping the land endlessly to fit themselves. This was not ideology, it was necessity. Over generations, this quieter world became normal. People did not long for cities they had never known. They did not dream of systems they could not imagine. Their ambitions matched their environment. This alignment created a different kind of security. Eventually, however, alignment bred confidence, and confidence invites expansion. As populations grew slowly, pressure returned gently. More children survived, more food was needed. Small innovations appeared, better tools, improved storage, new planting techniques. None of these were dangerous alone. Together, they opened the door to surplus again. Surplus changes everything. It creates time. Time allows specialization. Specialization creates distance between actions and consequences. Distance allows systems to grow. And so, once more, the seeds of civilization were planted, not in defiance of collapse, but because collapse had done its work. It had reduced complexity to a level where growth was possible again. This cycle is not accidental, it is ecological. Civilization behaves like a species that expands until it meets limits, then contracts until balance returns. Humanity survives both phases. Civilization does not always. Understanding this does not diminish civilization, it contextualizes it. It reminds us that civilization is a strategy, not a destiny, a tool, not an identity. The first collapse stripped civilization of its illusion of permanence, but it did not strip humanity of meaning. Meaning simply relocated. From monuments to relationships, from records to memory, from growth to continuity. In this quieter world, time felt different. Without large-scale planning, the future shortened. People planned for seasons, not centuries. This made loss easier to absorb. When expectations are modest, disappointment is survivable. Joy still existed, in good harvests, in shared meals, in surviving another winter. Joy was less amplified, but also less fragile. When new civilizations eventually rose nearby, they seemed strange, too busy, too confident, too complex. Some people joined them, others watched from a distance. Not everyone is drawn to complexity. Those who joined brought with them knowledge shaped by collapse, practical skills, adaptability, a sense of limits. These qualities helped new systems survive longer. But over time, as abundance returned, those voices softened. Prosperity mutes caution. The first collapse did not prevent future collapses, but it shaped how humanity endured them. Each cycle left behind subtle changes in behavior, culture, and expectation. Civilization learned even if it did not remember. This is how progress actually happens, not as a straight line, but as a spiral, returning to familiar points with slightly altered understanding. The first collapse was humanity's first encounter with its own scale, the realization that organizing the world changes the world, and that those changes have consequences beyond intention. That realization did not end ambition, but it planted doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable, but it is also protective. As the memory of the first collapse faded, doubt faded with it. Ambition returned unchallenged, and the cycle began again, yet something remained, a quiet capacity to live without civilization when necessary, a knowledge embedded not in texts but in behavior. Humanity learned that it could survive the loss of its greatest creations. That knowledge would matter again and again. When we speak of endurance, we must be careful. Endurance is often confused with permanence, but permanence is rare, and endurance does not require it. What endures is not what remains unchanged. What endures is what adapts. The first collapse of civilization revealed this truth slowly, gently, without ever announcing itself. Civilization disappeared in places. Humanity did not. And in that difference lies the quiet heart of this story. Long after cities had faded into low mounds and broken lines in the earth, long after their names had slipped from memory, people continued to wake each morning and shape their lives around the world as it was. They did not call themselves survivors. They did not call their time an aftermath. They simply lived. Living after collapse required attention. Attention to weather that no longer followed old expectations. Attention to land that had been worked too hard in earlier generations. Attention to relationships because cooperation replaced administration. This attention slowed life. Slowness became a form of intelligence. Without large systems to absorb mistakes, every decision carried weight. When to plant, how much to store, who to trust, when to move. These decisions were no longer abstract, they were immediate, and because they were immediate, people learned from them quickly. Failure taught faster lessons than success ever had. In this quieter world, ambition changed shape. It became smaller, not weaker, smaller. People did not dream of building cities that would last forever. They dreamed of feeding their families, of seeing their children grow, of surviving another season. These dreams were achievable, and because they were achievable, they were deeply motivating. The collapse of civilization stripped away illusions, the illusion that growth is natural, the illusion that complexity equals strength, the illusion that humans control the systems they depend on. What remained was humility. Not as a philosophy, as a condition. Humility does not feel inspiring, it feels careful, and careful people tend to survive. As generations passed, the memory of civilization's height became increasingly symbolic. Stories described a time when the world was full of people, full of goods, full of noise. Children listened with curiosity, not longing. That world felt distant, unreal, like a dream someone else once had. This distance softened judgment. The past was not seen as a failure, it was simply different. And because it was different, it did not haunt the present. From this perspective, the first collapse did not feel tragic. It felt like a change of seasons, long, uneven, unpredictable, but survivable. Eventually, new forms of organization emerged, not quite civilizations, not quite villages. Networks of communities that shared resources selectively, that cooperated without central control, that expanded cautiously. These forms lacked grandeur, but they were resilient. Resilience does not announce itself. It does not build monuments. It does not leave clear traces. It survives quietly, adapting to conditions rather than shaping them. Over time, humanity carried this resilience forward. Even as new civilizations rose, even as complexity returned, the underlying capacity to live simply never vanished. It waited. This waiting matters, because collapse is never the end of human possibility. It is the end of a particular arrangement, and arrangements can change. The first collapse taught humanity without words that identity does not depend on systems. People are not their cities, not their institutions, not their technologies. Those things are extensions, useful, powerful. Temporary, what is not temporary, is the human ability to adjust expectations, to redefine normal, to find meaning in altered circumstances. This ability is rarely celebrated. It does not produce legends, but it produces continuity. As we approach the end of this long reflection, it becomes clear that the first collapse of civilization was not a warning meant to be heard. It was an experience meant to be lived, and it was lived successfully. Civilization fell apart. Human life did not. This distinction is essential. If collapse were truly catastrophic, humanity would not be here to remember it. The fact that we are suggests something important. That collapse, while painful, is not annihilation. It is transformation. Transformation reshapes priorities. It strips away what cannot be sustained. It preserves what can. The first collapse preserved adaptability, preserved cooperation, preserved the quiet knowledge that survival does not require greatness. It requires balance. Balance is not static. It must be negotiated continuously, between ambition and restraint, between growth and recovery, between humans and the world that supports them. Civilization tends to forget this negotiation. It prefers certainty. It prefers control. Collapse reminds humanity that certainty is temporary. This reminder does not come as a message. It comes as experience, experience shared across generations. Experience embedded in behavior rather than belief. The people who lived after the first collapse did not write philosophies about limits. They lived within them, and that was enough. As new civilizations rose and fell across the ancient world, this quiet capacity followed humanity everywhere. It followed farmers, it followed migrants, it followed traders and settlers. It followed those who left cities behind. This capacity is why humanity persists, not because civilizations endure, but because humans do. The first collapse was not humanity's greatest failure. It was one of its earliest adaptations. Time continued to move forward even when no one was counting it. Without calendars carved in stone, without records pressed into clay, time was measured differently. It was measured in rains and dry seasons, in births and deaths, in how long a tool lasted before it broke, and how many winters an elder could still remember clearly. Time became intimate. And intimacy changed how people understood their place in the world. In the absence of grand timelines, people lived closer to the present. The future was not imagined as a distant, planned destination. It was imagined as the next season, the next harvest, the next generation. This narrowing of time did not shrink meaning, it concentrated it. When people think far into the future, they build monuments. When people think close to the present, they build relationships. After the first collapse, relationships mattered more than plans. Communities learned to read subtle signs. A change in bird patterns, a shift in wind direction, the smell of soil after rain. These signals were not abstract data, they were warnings and invitations. Without centralized authority, knowledge decentralized. Different communities learned different lessons. Some learned how to survive drought. Some learned how to live with floods. Some learned when to move and when to stay. Humanity diversified its strategies. This diversity was strength. The world after collapse was not uniform, it was patchwork, areas of recovery beside areas of abandonment, thriving valleys beside exhausted plains, small successes beside quiet failures. Life did not improve everywhere at once, and it did not decline everywhere either. This unevenness created movement. People traveled not as conquerors or merchants, but as observers. They carried stories, not stories of glory. Stories of conditions where water was reliable, where soil was forgiving, where cooperation was possible. These stories guided migration more effectively than any map. Migration after collapse was different from migration before it. It was slower, more cautious, less confident. People moved knowing that no place was permanently safe. This awareness tempered expectation. Expectation shapes disappointment. Lower expectations reduce shock. Collapse had taught humanity how to expect less without despair. In this quieter world, creativity did not disappear. It changed purpose. Art became functional. Beauty appeared in tools. Music accompanied work rather than ceremony. Creativity served life rather than power. Language softened. Without bureaucracy, speech became personal. Words were chosen carefully because misunderstandings carried immediate consequences. Communication grew precise, not elaborate. Precision replaced abstraction. People spoke about what they could see, touch, and change. Grand ideas lost relevance. Practical wisdom gained it. This shift affected belief systems. Cosmologies simplified. Instead of vast hierarchies of gods, belief focused on forces. Rain, sun, earth, chance. Belief became less about control and more about acceptance. Acceptance is not surrender, it is alignment. Alignment allowed communities to exist within uncertainty without constant fear. Fear requires expectation. Acceptance allows adaptation. Over time, humanity grew comfortable with impermanence. This comfort did not eliminate loss, it made loss survivable. The collapse had removed the illusion that effort guaranteed outcome. People learned that hard work mattered but did not decide everything. This lesson reduced blame. When things went wrong, people mourned rather than accused. Blame had once fractured societies. After collapse, cooperation became more valuable than fault-finding. Children absorbed this worldview without being taught. They learned it by watching adults respond to failure. They learned that failure was not shameful, it was information. Information shapes behavior. Behavior shapes survival. As generations passed, some communities grew again, slowly, carefully. They experimented with scale, small storage systems, limited coordination, temporary leadership. They tested complexity rather than committing to it fully. These experiments were not labeled as such. They were just attempts. Some worked, some failed. Failure was no longer catastrophic, it was local. Local failure does not destroy humanity, it instructs it. From this period emerged a quiet cultural memory, not of cities falling, but of caution. Caution embedded in proverbs, in rituals of restraint, in taboos against overuse. These cultural fragments mattered, even when their origins were forgotten. Culture remembered what history did not. As new civilizations eventually formed nearby, they encountered communities shaped by collapse. These communities appeared conservative, slow to trust, reluctant to centralize, skeptical of promises. Civilization often interpreted this as backwardness. It was not, it was experience. Some of this experience transferred. New civilizations incorporated checks, limits on leaders, rotating authority, shared responsibility. These measures extended stability, but they did not eliminate risk. Risk is inherent in scale. As centuries layered over centuries, humanity moved further from the first collapse. Memory thinned, confidence returned, complexity rose again. But the underlying human capacity to endure contraction never disappeared. This capacity is humanity's quiet inheritance. It does not belong to any culture. It does not require teaching. It emerges when needed. Collapse strips away excess. What remains is what matters. This is not comforting, but it is clarifying. The first collapse clarified humanity's relationship with civilization. Civilization is something humans do, not something they are. This distinction matters because it means humanity can survive without civilization, but civilization cannot survive without humanity. As we continue this narration, we will remain within this long middle space after collapse, before renewal, a space rarely described but deeply important because most of human history exists here, not at peaks, not at endings. But in adjustment is quiet. It does not inspire monuments, but it carries humanity forward. Slowness reshaped everything. When speed disappeared, attention returned. Without schedules enforced by institutions, days unfolded according to light and weather. Work began when it could and ended when it must. Rest was not earned through productivity. It was taken when the body required it. This rhythm did not feel inefficient. It felt human. In this slower world, decisions were revisited often. Nothing was assumed permanent. A field might be used this year and abandoned the next. A settlement might grow briefly, then disperse. A leader might guide for a season, then step aside. Flexibility replaced commitment. Commitment had once been a virtue. Now it was a risk. Risk awareness sharpened perception. People noticed patterns more readily. They remembered which choices led to hardship and which led to recovery. They remembered not through charts or records, but through stories told repeatedly, shaped by emotion and consequence. Stories became data. Data embedded in narrative lasts longer than data carved in stone because it lives in people. The landscape itself became a teacher. A dried riverbed told a story of overuse or changing climate. A recovering forest showed what patience could achieve. An abandoned city mound reminded people that even the largest works could be temporary. These lessons were not framed as warnings. They were simply present. Presence changes behavior. People did not need to be told that overexpansion was dangerous. They had seen where it led. Over time, communities developed subtle boundaries, not borders enforced by walls, boundaries of agreement. This land will rest, that water will be shared, these trees will not be cut, boundaries enforced socially rather than legally. Breaking them carried consequences, not punishment, loss of trust. Trust became currency, more valuable than goods, more durable than authority. Without formal hierarchies, influence emerged differently. Those who listened well gained respect. Those who remembered accurately were consulted. Those who acted generously were followed. Leadership became situational, temporary, responsive. This form of leadership lacked spectacle. It rarely produced monuments or records, but it worked. The collapse had removed the idea that leadership guaranteed safety. People no longer expected leaders to protect them from uncertainty. They expected leaders to help them navigate it. This expectation was more realistic. As centuries passed, the memory of centralized power softened into curiosity. People wondered how such systems had functioned, how strangers had coordinated across distances, how decisions had been enforced without personal relationships. These questions were asked without envy, they were puzzles. Past became a landscape of questions rather than answers. In this world, technology did not disappear. It evolved cautiously. Tools were improved incrementally. Nothing was adopted without testing. Innovation slowed, but it became more reliable. Reliability matters more than novelty when survival is at stake. Communities favored tools that could be repaired easily. That required few materials. That did not depend on distant supply. This preference limited complexity and preserved autonomy. Autonomy does not mean isolation. Communities still interacted. They exchanged ideas. They exchanged people through marriage and migration, but dependence remained limited. Limited dependence reduces vulnerability. Collapse had taught this lesson clearly. As generations unfolded, children grew up in a world without spectacle, without massive structures, without overwhelming noise. Their sense of scale was intimate, a valley, a river bend, a cluster of homes. The world felt comprehensible. Comprehensibility reduces anxiety. When the world feels too large, people feel small. When the world feels human-sized, people feel capable. This sense of capability mattered. It gave people confidence without arrogance, confidence rooted in experience rather than assumption. Occasionally, stories of distant cities reached these communities, stories of towering walls, of rulers with absolute authority, of markets overflowing with goods. These stories were met with mixed reactions: curiosity, skepticism, concern. Some young people felt drawn to these places. They left, seeking opportunity, seeking excitement, seeking something larger. Some returned, some did not. Those who returned brought stories of complexity, of abundance paired with fragility, of order maintained through force, of systems impressive but demanding. These stories enriched understanding, but they did not inspire imitation wholesale. Collapse had taught people to evaluate, not assume. The quiet world after collapse was not static. It evolved slowly, adapting to new pressures, responding to subtle changes, but it did so without the urgency that once drove expansion. Urgency accelerates mistakes, slowness reveals them. This period of human history left few traces. Archaeology struggles to capture it, because what survived was behavior, not buildings. What mattered was practice, not production. This invisibility is why collapse is often misunderstood. History favors what leaves remains, but survival often leaves none. The first collapse did not create a dark age, it created an unrecorded one. A time when life continued without leaving much behind. Yet this unrecorded time shaped everything that followed. It refined humanity's ability to live within limits. It strengthened social bonds. It normalized impermanence. Impermanence became a background assumption, not feared, accepted. Acceptance does not eliminate ambition, it reframes it. Ambition became relational, to care well, to endure well, to leave children capable rather than wealthy. Wealth had once been stored grain and monuments. Now it was knowledge and trust. These could not be seized. They had to be built. As this worldview spread quietly across generations, humanity became more resilient, not because conditions improved, but because expectations aligned more closely with reality. Eventually, pressure would build again, population would grow, surplus would return in pockets. Complexity would tempt, this cycle would repeat, but repetition does not mean redundancy. Each cycle leaves residue, subtle changes, adjusted instincts, modified expectations. Humanity does not reset after collapse, it recalibrates. The first collapse recalibrated humanity's sense of scale, of time, of possibility. It taught without instruction that survival does not require dominance, it requires responsiveness. As we continue forward in this narration, we remain within this recalibrated humanity. a humanity that has learned how to live without certainty, without permanence, without guarantees. This humanity is quieter, but it is not diminished. As the centuries continued to pass, something subtle but profound took shape within humanity. It was not a new invention. It was not a new belief. It was not a new system. It was a posture. A way of standing within uncertainty without demanding that uncertainty disappear. People no longer expected the world to behave consistently. They expected it to change, and this expectation altered everything. When rain came late, it was not interpreted as betrayal. When rivers shifted, it was not treated as injustice. When harvests failed, it was not always blamed on error. Sometimes it was simply accepted as variation. This acceptance did not make hardship easy. But it made hardship intelligible. Intelligible hardship is survivable. Incomprehensible hardship breaks people. Civilization in its earliest form had promised comprehension, predictable systems, ordered hierarchies, clear causes and effects. Collapse shattered that promise, but in doing so it returned humanity to an older truth, that the world does not owe coherence to human plans. Once this truth settled into daily life, people stopped fighting it. They worked with probability instead of certainty. They planned loosely. They prepared for multiple outcomes. They avoided single points of failure. Redundancy became wisdom, not excess, but overlap: more than one water source, more than one crop, more than one skill per person. Diversity replaced efficiency. Efficiency is powerful, but diversity endures. Children raised in this world grew up differently. They were taught not only how to succeed, but how to fail, how to lose a harvest and continue. How to move without shame, how to begin again without resentment. These lessons were not spoken, they were modeled. Modeling is more durable than instruction. As communities interacted, these behaviors spread, not through conquest, through observation. People noticed which groups endured. They noticed which ones recovered quickly. They noticed which ones disappeared. Survival patterns became visible. Over time, humanity refined a quiet rule: do not build faster than you can adapt. This rule was never written, but it was lived. In places where people ignored it, fragility returned. In places where people respected it, stability followed. Stability in this context did not mean permanence. It meant recoverability, the ability to be disrupted without being destroyed. Recoverability became the new measure of success, not size, not wealth, not influence, but the ability to endure disruption. This shift was revolutionary, even though no one announced it. Civilizations that rose later in distant regions unknowingly benefited from this shift. They inherited people shaped by collapse, people who questioned expansion, people who noticed warning signs, people who remembered instinctively that complexity carries cost. These instincts did not prevent new collapses, but they altered their texture. Some collapses were slower, some were softer, some left more survivors. The first collapse had changed humanity's relationship with failure. Failure was no longer the end of meaning. It was a phase. Phases pass. This understanding reduced desperation, and desperation often causes the worst decisions. As humanity moved through this long middle space of history, neither fully collapsed nor fully rebuilt. Something else emerged, a deeper sense of continuity, not continuity of structures, continuity of life. Life flowed around ruins the way water flows around stones. It did not stop, it adjusted. This flowing quality of humanity is easy to overlook. History prefers sharp edges, beginnings, endings, revolutions, but most of existence happens between these moments. The first collapse expanded that middle space, it stretched it, it made room for slower forms of life to persist. Within this space, humans rediscovered cooperation without command. They rediscovered memory without record. They rediscovered identity without empire. Identity narrowed. People identified with place rather than abstraction, with people rather than institutions, with practice rather than belief. This narrowing reduced conflict. Large identities invite opposition. Small identities encourage negotiation. Negotiation became essential. Resources were limited, conditions uncertain. No one could afford prolonged hostility. Conflict still occurred, but it resolved faster, because everyone understood what prolonged conflict cost. Cost awareness shaped ethics. Not morality imposed from above, but ethics emerging from consequence. Stealing endangered trust. Violence threatened cooperation. Hoarding invited isolation. Ethical behavior aligned with survival. This alignment strengthened communities, not by idealism, by realism. Realism is not pessimism, it is clarity. Over long periods, this clarity reshaped human psychology. People became less attached to outcomes, more attached to process. They focused on how they lived, not what they accumulated. Accumulation lost meaning when permanence was uncertain. What mattered was circulation. Food shared, knowledge shared, labor shared. Sharing increased resilience. It distributed risk. The first collapse had shown humanity what happened when risk concentrated, when cities depended on narrow margins, when systems had no buffers. Buffers became essential. Social buffers, ecological buffers, psychological buffers. Psychological buffers mattered deeply. People learned how to grieve without despair. How to lose without collapsing internally, how to rebuild without clinging to the past. This emotional flexibility was one of the collapse's most enduring legacies, even though no one named it. As generations lived within this emotional landscape, something softened, fear diminished, not because danger disappeared, but because danger was expected. Expectation changes response. When danger is unexpected, it paralyses. When danger is anticipated, it mobilizes. The first collapse transformed danger from shock into background. This made humanity calmer, not safer, calmer. Calm enables thought, thought enables choice, choice matters even in constrained circumstances. This is how humanity carried forward after civilization fell, not triumphantly, not despairingly, but steadily. The long shadow of the first collapse did not darken the future. It shaded it, provided contrast, made light more meaningful. As we continue this narration, we remain within this deep continuity. We are still not at the end. We are not approaching resolution. We are inhabiting duration. Duration is where humanity becomes itself, not in moments of rise, not in moments of fall, but in the long work of living. In the long stretch of time after the first collapse, humanity learned something that had never been fully understood before. That continuity does not require stability. It requires motion, not frantic motion. Not expansion, but quiet, responsive movement through changing conditions. When stability vanished, people stopped trying to preserve exact forms. They stopped trying to hold the world in place. Instead, they learned how to move with it. Movement took many shapes. Sometimes it meant migration. Sometimes it meant changing crops. Sometimes it meant altering traditions. Sometimes it meant letting go of stories that no longer fit lived reality. Letting go became a skill. Letting go is difficult for civilizations, but individuals learn it more easily. And after the collapse, life returned to the scale of individuals, families, small groups, faces known by name. At this scale, adaptation is faster. Without vast populations to coordinate, change could happen quietly. A field left unused, a custom altered, a practice abandoned. No declarations were needed, no resistance formed. Life adjusted. This capacity to adjust without drama became humanity's most important inheritance. Even when civilizations later returned, this capacity remained beneath the surface. Waiting is not inactivity, it is readiness. Readiness allowed people to survive periods of uncertainty without panic. Panic wastes energy. Energy mattered now. After collapse, energy was conserved instinctively. People worked when work mattered. They rested when rest was required. They avoided unnecessary effort. Not out of laziness, out of wisdom. This wisdom reshaped social values. Excessive ambition was no longer admired. Reliability was consistency, presence. The most respected people were not those who promised change. They were those who showed up every day, who endured. Endurance became a quiet virtue, not celebrated, but noticed. This shift altered how people viewed time. Instead of thinking in terms of achievement, they thought in terms of continuity, how long something could be maintained, how gently it could be sustained. Sustainability was not a concept, it was a habit. Habits shape futures more reliably than plans. As years passed into decades and decades into centuries, the world became layered with human memory that was not written. Memory lived in paths worn into the land, in fields that had once been farms, then forests, then farms again, in settlements that appeared, disappeared, and reappeared nearby. The land remembered human presence even when humans forgot themselves. This relationship between people and land grew reciprocal. People no longer assumed ownership. They assumed participation. Participation changes perspective. Owners extract. Participants negotiate. Negotiation requires attention. Attention requires time. The slower world after collapse allowed time to return. Time returned to people. It was no longer consumed by systems that demanded constant maintenance. No longer spent feeding structures that existed for their own sake. Time could be spent observing, listening, responding. This time richness compensated for material scarcity. People had fewer things but more moments. Moments accumulated into meaning. Meaning no longer required permanence, it required presence. Presence anchored people in the present without erasing the past. Stories still existed, but they were told differently, not as linear progress, but as cycles. Cycles normalize return. They teach that loss is not final, that recovery is possible. That decline does not negate what came before. This cyclical worldview softened despair. Despair thrives on finality. Collapse had removed finality. People came to understand that endings were also beginnings, not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually. This understanding was not philosophical, it was experiential, learned through living in the aftermath. As this worldview spread, humanity's relationship with ambition changed again. Ambition became conditional. People asked not only can we do this, but can we continue doing this? This second question mattered more. Continuation became the measure of success. This shift did not eliminate creativity, it redirected it. Creativity served continuity rather than novelty. Innovation became incremental. Adaptation replaced transformation. Incremental change is less exciting, but more survivable. This survivability allowed humanity to persist through long periods of uncertainty without collapsing socially. Collapse became structural, not existential. Systems failed, life continued. This distinction is critical because it reveals that humanity is more resilient than its systems. The first collapse did not erase human dignity. It stripped away illusions that had obscured it. Dignity returned to simple acts: care, work, sharing. These acts do not require civilization, they require people. As humanity moved further from the collapse, the sharpness of its lessons dulled, but they never vanished completely. They remained embedded in behavior, in caution, in restraint, in an intuitive sense of limits. This intuition surfaced whenever conditions grew strained. People slowed, they reduced scale, they simplified, often without knowing why. This unconscious wisdom saved lives again and again. Even as new civilizations formed, rose, and fell elsewhere, the deeper human pattern remained unchanged. adapt, adjust, continue. History often frames humanity as a builder, a maker of cities, a conqueror of landscapes, but after the first collapse, humanity revealed another identity, a keeper, a steward, a participant. Participation does not dominate, it listens. Listening to the world allowed humanity to remain within it, even when the world changed. As we continue this narration, we remain in this listening mode, not rushing toward conclusions, not closing the story, but allowing it to unfold further. The first collapse was not a punctuation mark, it was a pause, a long one. There is a quiet moment that arrives after long endurance. It does not announce itself, it does not feel triumphant, it feels settled. This moment came slowly to humanity after the first collapse, not everywhere at once, not in the same way, but gradually across lives that no longer expected resolution. People stopped waiting for things to return to how they once were. This was not resignation, it was recognition. The recognition that the past was not a destination. It was a condition that had existed and then passed. When expectation of return fades, attention shifts. People stop scanning the horizon for restoration. They look instead at what is already present, what is workable, what is alive, what can be tended. Tending became central, not controlling, not mastering, tending. Fields were tended with an understanding that they might not last forever. Relationships were tended with the knowledge that they required care to survive stress. Communities were tended with the awareness that cohesion could dissolve if neglected. Nothing was assumed permanent, and because nothing was assumed permanent, everything received attention. Attention is a form of respect. After collapse, respect replaced dominance as humanity's primary posture toward the world, not because people became enlightened, because dominance had failed. Dominance promised certainty. Collapse exposed its fragility. The first civilizations had tried to fix the world in place, to regulate it, to command it, to extract from it predictably. After collapse, people understood that the world does not remain still. Trying to force stillness invites strain. Instead, people learned to move gently with change, to read shifts early, to respond before pressure accumulated. This responsiveness reduced shock. Shock had once been devastating. When systems failed suddenly, people were unprepared. After collapse, preparation became continuous, not dramatic, continuous. Preparation did not mean stockpiling endlessly. It meant flexibility, knowing alternative routes, knowing multiple food sources, knowing how to improvise. Improvisation became a core skill. Not celebrated, expected. Children grew up practicing it. They learned how to repair rather than replace, how to adjust rather than insist, how to abandon plans without seeing abandonment as failure. This mindset softened attachment. People still cared deeply, but they cared without clinging. Clinging creates suffering when conditions change. Collapse had taught this lesson thoroughly. As the centuries unfolded, humanity carried this softened attachment forward. Even when abundance returned in some places, people remained cautious. They enjoyed surplus, but they did not trust it completely. Trust after collapse was earned slowly and revoked gently. Gentleness mattered. Harsh responses had once escalated crises. Gentle correction prevented them. This gentleness did not mean passivity. It meant proportion, responding at the scale of the problem, not inflating challenges into catastrophes. Perspective had changed. People measured events against long memory, not written memory. Embodied memory. Embodied memory lives in behavior, in hesitation before overuse, in reluctance to centralize power, in skepticism toward promises of permanence. These hesitations slowed growth, but they extended continuity. Continuity is not dramatic, it is repetitive. Days resemble each other. Seasons follow familiar arcs. Life feels ordinary. Ordinariness is undervalued, but it is where humanity survives. The first collapse ray centered humanity in the ordinary, removed the illusion that greatness was necessary for meaning, revealed that survival itself is an achievement. This revelation did not inspire pride, it inspired steadiness. Steadiness is a quiet strength, it does not surge, it holds. As communities lived steadily, social bonds deepened. Shared hardship created mutual understanding. People learned each other's limits and respected them. Respect for limits became foundational. Not just environmental limits, human limits. People learned that exhaustion weakens judgment, that overwork invites error, that rest is not indulgence, it is maintenance. Maintenance replaced expansion as the central activity of life. Maintaining tools, maintaining relationships, maintaining land. Maintenance is invisible in history. It leaves few traces, but it sustains everything. Civilizations often neglect maintenance. They focus on creation. After collapse, humanity understood that creation without maintenance is temporary. This understanding reshaped ambition yet again. Ambition became quieter, focused on keeping things working rather than making them impressive. This shift altered aesthetics. Beauty was found in durability, in balance, in things that aged well. A well-worn path was admired, a repaired tool respected, a long-standing relationship valued. Value moved from novelty to longevity. Longevity, however, was never assumed. It was earned daily. This daily earning grounded people in the present, not as mindfulness, as necessity. Necessity can be grounding. It narrows focus, removes abstraction, clarifies priorities. The first collapse stripped humanity of abstractions it could no longer afford. What remained was direct engagement with life. Direct engagement reduced alienation. People felt connected to outcomes. They saw the results of their actions, positive and negative. Seeing consequences fosters responsibility. Responsibility fosters care. Care became the quiet organizing principle of life, not enforced, chosen. As care spread, conflict softened, not disappeared, softened. Disagreements resolved faster, because prolonged conflict threatened survival. Survival incentivized cooperation, not ideology. This cooperative instinct did not erase individual differences, it contextualized them. People could disagree and still depend on each other. Dependence was acknowledged openly. No one pretended independence. This honesty reduced tension. The first collapse dissolved the myth of self-sufficiency. People survived together or not at all. This truth was not philosophical, it was experiential. As humanity lived with this truth, social resilience increased. Communities absorbed shocks more effectively. Losses were shared, recovery was collective. Collective recovery does not require centralized power, it requires trust. Trust grows slowly. Collapse slowed everything, including trust building, but what grew slowly lasted longer. As we continue this narration, we remain within this slow, durable humanity. A humanity that has learned how to exist without guarantees, without monuments, without certainty. This humanity is not weaker, it is less brittle. The first collapse of civilization did not create an ending, it created a long middle. A middle where humanity learned to live without the scaffolding it once believed essential. We are still within that middle. Still walking through it, still listening. With time, even steadiness begins to feel natural. What once required attention becomes habit. What once felt fragile begins to feel ordinary. And so, after many generations living within limits, humanity reached another quiet threshold, not a return to civilization, not an escape from collapse, but a deep familiarity with living in between. This familiarity reshaped emotion. Fear did not disappear, but it softened. Hope did not vanish. But it became measured. People no longer swung wildly between expectation and despair. They lived within a narrower emotional range, and within that range they found balance. Balance is not static, it shifts constantly, but people learned to sense when it was drifting. They felt it in exhaustion, in tension between neighbors, in the land's response to effort. These sensations became signals. Signals replaced rules. Rules require enforcement. Signals invite response. When signals were ignored, consequences followed quickly enough to be noticed. When they were heeded, life stabilized. This feedback loop trained perception. Perception became the primary skill of survival, not prediction, not control, perception. People learned to notice small changes early. A field producing slightly less, a stream running a little shallower, a relationship growing strained. They intervened gently. Before crisis formed, this gentleness mattered. Harsh interventions often created new problems. Gentle ones allowed adjustment. Adjustment is easier than repair. Collapse had taught this lesson repeatedly. Over long periods, this way of living reshaped human temperament. Patience increased, impulsiveness decreased. People became more comfortable waiting. Waiting had once felt like failure, now it felt prudent. This patience extended to decision-making. Choices were delayed when necessary. Immediate action was no longer reflexive. People paused. Considered, consulted, consultation mattered. Without centralized authority, wisdom emerged through conversation. People shared perspectives, not to reach perfection, to avoid blindness. Blindness had been dangerous. Collapse had revealed what happens when systems ignore reality too long. Reality after collapse became unavoidable. There were no abstractions to hide behind, no distant institutions to absorb consequences. This directness altered language. Speech grew concrete. Metaphors were drawn from land and weather rather than power and conquest. People spoke of flow, balance, and wear. Language mirrored experience. When language aligns with reality, misunderstanding decreases. People argue less about symbols, more about practical differences. Practical disagreements are easier to resolve. They have shared reference points. As centuries unfolded, humanity's relationship with memory continued to evolve. Without written records, memory became selective. Not everything could be remembered, so people remembered what mattered most. They remembered places where survival had been possible. They remembered mistakes that had cost lives. They remembered behaviors that preserved cohesion. They did not remember dates. They did not remember rulers. They did not remember grand narratives. This selectivity was not loss. It was refinement. Refinement sharpened focus. People oriented themselves toward continuity rather than legacy. Legacy implies permanence. Continuity implies participation. Participation keeps memory alive. Legacy freezes it. Frozen memory becomes brittle. Participatory memory adapts. The first collapse transformed memory from archive into practice. People remembered by doing, by repeating actions that had worked, by avoiding actions that had failed. This form of memory does not require preservation, it requires repetition. Repetition shaped culture. Rituals emerged that reinforced restraint, seasonal pauses. Periods of rest, times when land was deliberately left untouched. These rituals were not framed as sacrifices, they were framed as care. Care became the moral center of life, not achievement, not expansion. Care. Care extended beyond humans, to animals, to soil, to water, not out of sentimentality, out of recognition. Recognition that harming these systems harmed oneself. Collapse had clarified interdependence. Interdependence discourages extremes. It discourages hoarding. Discourages exploitation, encourages reciprocity. Reciprocity stabilized relationships between people, between communities, between humans and the environment. Stability, however, was never assumed permanent. This distinction mattered. People enjoyed periods of abundance without mistaking them for guarantees. Guarantees had once justified risk. After collapse, guarantees were distrusted. This distrust was not cynical, it was grounded. Grounded people make fewer catastrophic errors. As the long post-collapse centuries continued, the world did not remain static. Climates shifted. Populations rose and fell. Technologies appeared slowly. Humanity met these changes with adaptability rather than certainty. They adjusted patterns, shifted locations, modified expectations. Expectations became flexible, not rigid. This flexibility reduced suffering. Suffering did not vanish, but it became contextualized. A bad year was not interpreted as failure of the world. It was interpreted as a difficult year. This distinction matters. It prevents despair from generalizing. Generalized despair paralyses. Contextualized hardship mobilizes. The first collapse taught humanity how to contextualize hardship without philosophy, without doctrine, through experience. Experience is a patient teacher, but its lessons endure. As generations continued, some people once again began to dream of larger structures, not empires, but coordinated efforts. Shared irrigation projects, trade networks, these efforts emerged cautiously. They were tested incrementally, expanded slowly. People remembered instinctively that scale magnifies consequence, so scale was approached carefully. Careful expansion is less visible in history, but it lasts longer. When these new structures faltered, they did not bring everything down with them. They were allowed to fail locally. Lessons were absorbed. Life continued. Failure without catastrophe became possible. This was new. The first collapse had taught humanity how to fail safely. Safe failure is the foundation of resilience. Resilience does not prevent disruption, it absorbs it. This absorption allowed humanity to persist through uncertainties that would have destroyed earlier systems. As time moved forward, humanity carried this resilience quietly. It did not announce itself. It did not claim superiority. It simply endured. Endurance reshaped values again. People admired those who could adapt gracefully, who did not cling desperately to what no longer worked, who could let go without bitterness. Bitterness corrodes communities. Collapse had shown its cost. Grace under change became a respected trait. This respect influenced leadership. Leaders were chosen not for vision alone, but for steadiness, for listening, for the ability to step aside. Stepping aside was not seen as weakness, it was seen as wisdom. Wisdom after collapse was not about knowledge accumulation, it was about judgment. Judgment formed slowly, through mistakes, through observation, through humility. Humility became widespread, not as a moral posture, as a survival strategy. The world after collapse did not reward arrogance, it punished it. Punishment was not moral, it was mechanical. Overreach led to exhaustion. Exhaustion led to failure. This mechanical clarity removed the drama from decline. Decline was not interpreted as judgment, it was interpreted as signal. Signals invited response, not shame. This reduction of shame mattered deeply. Shame discourages adaptation. It locks people into denial. After collapse, denial became harder to sustain. Reality was too immediate. This immediacy anchored humanity, prevented drift into abstraction. As we continue this narration, we remain within this anchored humanity, a humanity shaped not by glory or ruin, but by adjustment. The first collapse of civilization did not teach humanity how to win. It taught humanity how to continue. And continuation, more than victory, defines survival. Eventually, even the memory of collapse itself became indistinct, not erased, not denied, simply distant. It was no longer a story people told in full. It was a feeling carried quietly beneath decisions, a hesitation before excess, a pause before commitment, a question asked before expansion. The question was rarely spoken aloud. It lived in the body. Bodies remember what stories forget. They remember hunger. They remember exhaustion. They remember the subtle warning that comes before things unravel. This embodied memory guided humanity long after words failed. As centuries layered upon centuries, people lived entire lives without ever hearing the word civilization spoken as an idea. They lived it sometimes. They stepped away from it at others, but they did not name it. Naming creates distance. Living does not. In this unnamed world, cycles continued. Rain returned and vanished again. Land healed in some places and failed in others. Communities gathered and scattered. Nothing stayed fixed long enough to demand belief. Belief softened, not disappeared, softened. People still believed in meaning, but meaning was no longer anchored to permanence. It was anchored to participation, to showing up, to contributing, to caring. Care became quieter with time. It did not seek recognition. It did not demand reward. It simply existed because without it, life frayed. Fraying had become familiar, not frightening. People recognized its early signs and they responded. Response did not always prevent loss, but it prevented collapse from becoming annihilation. This distinction mattered. The first collapse had taught humanity that systems could disappear while life continued. Later generations internalized this truth. They stopped equating the loss of structure with the loss of meaning. Meaning relocated from architecture to behavior, from institutions to relationships. From permanence to continuity. Continuity does not require sameness, it requires connection. Connection survived the first collapse because it is lighter than structure. Structures resist change, connections move with it. As humanity lived within this understanding, social forms diversified. There was no single way to organize life. Different communities tried different approaches. Some centralized briefly, some remained diffuse, some alternated between the two. Alternation became acceptable. People no longer demanded consistency across generations. What worked now was allowed to change later. This tolerance for change reduced intergenerational conflict. Elders did not insist on permanence. Youth did not rebel against it. Each generation adjusted its inheritance. Inheritance became practical. Tools, skills, stories that still applied. What no longer applied was allowed to fade. Fading is not loss. It is release. Release made room for new conditions, for new responses. New forms of life. The world after collapse was not stagnant. It was fluid. Fluidity requires trust, trust in one's ability to respond, trust in others to cooperate, trust in the world to remain even if altered. This trust was cautious, but it was real. Cautious trust is stronger than blind confidence. Blind confidence breaks easily. As people lived with cautious trust, emotional extremes softened further. Joy became quieter but steadier. Sorrow remained but did not overwhelm. Life was experienced as variable rather than volatile. Volatility had once defined collapse. Variability defined what came after. Variability invites learning. Volatility invites fear. The first collapse transformed volatility into variability. By slowing everything down, by breaking large systems into smaller ones, by returning consequence to human scale. Scale matters. When problems are too large, people feel powerless. When problems are human-sized, people respond. Response builds agency. Agency builds resilience. Resilience does not require optimism. It requires engagement. People engaged with life directly. They did not wait for systems to solve problems. They solved what they could. They accepted what they could not. Acceptance became active rather than passive. It did not mean giving up. It meant choosing effort carefully. Careful effort preserves energy. Energy preserves life. As generations passed, humanity became skilled at conserving itself. Not hoarding, conserving, conservation applied to everything. land, labor, emotion, attention. Attention especially was treated as precious. There were fewer distractions, fewer competing demands. Life unfolded within narrower frames. Narrow frames reduced overwhelm. Overwhelm had once driven reckless expansion. Without overwhelm, people could think clearly. Clarity does not require certainty. It requires calm. Calm became common, not universal, but common enough to shape culture. Culture after collapse was understated. It valued endurance over brilliance, reliability over charisma, listening over speaking. Speaking still mattered, but it was measured. Words were chosen carefully because words shaped action. Action shaped consequence. Consequence shaped memory. This chain remained visible. Nothing was abstracted far away. As humanity lived within this visibility, denial became difficult. People could not easily ignore reality. It was present, immediate. Immediate reality is grounding. It prevents myth from overtaking experience. Myth did not disappear. It changed role. It explained cycles rather than destinies. It taught rhythm rather than promise. Rhythm guided expectation. Expectation guided behavior. Behavior stabilized life. The first collapse had dismantled the illusion of linear progress. What replaced it was cyclical understanding, not as theory, as lived truth. Cycles normalize return. They remind people that difficulty does not negate meaning, that ease does not guarantee permanence. This normalization reduced panic during hardship. Hardship was unpleasant, but not incomprehensible. Incomprehensibility creates terror. Comprehension creates response. Response creates survival. As centuries continued, humanity carried this quiet competence forward. It was not celebrated, it was assumed. This assumption is why later histories overlook it. Historians search for drama, but survival is often quiet. The first collapse of civilization did not produce heroes remembered by name. It produced countless unnamed lives that continued anyway. Continuation is not glamorous, but it is everything. As we keep narrating, we remain within this long continuation, still not at an ending, still not drawing conclusions, still walking alongside humanity as it moves through time without guarantees. The story has not resolved, it has only deepened. In the end, there was no ending, there was only continuation. The first collapse of civilization did not conclude with silence, nor with rebirth announced in ceremony. It faded the way daylight fades into evening, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually enough that the eye adjusted without protest. Civilization loosened its grip, humanity did not. What endured was not the shape of cities, but the shape of life. People continued to wake each morning. They continued to care for children. They continued to share food, to mourn losses, to celebrate survival. Life persisted not because it was protected by systems, but because it adapted to their absence. The great lesson of the first collapse was never written down. It could not be. It was learned only by living through change slowly enough to understand it. That lesson was simple. Civilization is temporary. Humanity is not. When structures fall away, what remains is relationship between people, between generations, between humans and the land beneath their feet. These relationships do not require permanence, they require attention. Attention was the quiet inheritance passed down from the first collapse. Attention to limits, attention to balance, attention to consequence. Attention that prevented the worst mistakes from being repeated too quickly, not forever, but long enough. The people who lived after the first collapse did not see themselves as caretakers of history. They saw themselves as caretakers of life. And that difference mattered. They did not ask whether their world would last forever. They asked whether it would last long enough for children to grow, long enough for land to recover, long enough for meaning to remain possible. Meaning survived without monuments. It survived in work done carefully, in restraint practiced quietly, in care extended without expectation of reward. Meaning survived because people chose to keep living thoughtfully even when certainty was gone. The first collapse revealed that collapse itself is not the greatest danger. The greatest danger is forgetting how to live when collapse arrives. Humanity did not forget. Again and again, across centuries and landscapes, people proved capable of stepping down from complexity without losing dignity. They proved capable of letting go without despair. They proved capable of living smaller lives without smaller hearts. Civilization would rise again. It always does. New cities, new systems, new ambitions. And one day those two would falter. But beneath every rise and fall, the same quiet current would continue to flow. Human life adapting, human meaning shifting, human endurance persisting. The first collapse was not a warning carved in stone. It was a whisper carried forward in behavior. A whisper that says, live lightly, pay attention, care for what sustains you. And remember that no structure, no matter how grand, replaces the simple work of living well. This is where the story rests. Not with certainty, not with fear, but with quiet understanding. Civilization may come and go, but as long as humans remember how to adapt, how to care, and how to continue, the story does not end. If you've stayed with this story to the end, thank you for listening. If this kind of quiet history helps you rest, reflect, or fall asleep, consider subscribing to the channel so you can join us again. Leave a comment and let us know where you're listening from, whether it's late at night, early morning, or somewhere in between. And wherever you are, may the past be gentle, may the present be calm, and may the night carry you softly onward.